Right, thanks. All right, thanks for coming. Guys, so accounts of so-called biological individuality aim to address basic metaphysical and ontological questions concerning the existence, nature, composition, boundaries, persistence, all that kind of stuff, of entities within the biological world. Recent work in the philosophy of biology commonly distinguishes between evolutionary and physiological accounts of biological individuality, where evolutionary accounts foreground the theory of evolution, the idea of being a unit, a target for natural selection, and physiological accounts foreground physiological sciences and ideas of functional and metabolic cohesion, integration, unity. And often accounts of each sort are thought to have some theoretical utility, but to in some sense conflict in their verdicts concerning which entities and pluralities are going to be counted as biological individuals. And so, at least among certain circles within the philosophy of biology, it's become de rigueur to respond to this conflict by endorsing some sort of pluralism. Pluralism here is the view that at least one account of each type is correct, but that there is in fact no conflict because they in some sense just concern different things. And one consequence of this, as it's often understood, I think is the existence of at least two distinct but closely overlapping things corresponding to what we might otherwise have taken to be a single organism. So where you are, for example, there's going to be both an evolutionary individual and a physiological individual in their composition in nature. So today, I want to argue that this response is mistaken, or at least unmotivated. And this is so because the insights of evolutionary physiological accounts will, in principle, be harmonized without accepting a pluralism of that sort. And the key idea is going to be that each sort of account can fruitfully be read as speaking to distinct questions, with a sense of conflict generated by a natural but mistaken assumption about how the answers they give to these questions must relate. And I'll suggest that this assumption amounts to a fallacy of composition. That is, the fallacy is simply assuming that some property of a part must be a property of the whole, or vice versa. To make the case for this, I'm going to begin by very briefly sketching one particular evolutionary account of Peter Godfrey Smith and one particular physiological account from Thomas Perdue. Okay, so to start the evolutionary account. So according to Godfrey Smith, evolutionary, as he terms them Darwinian individuals, are members of a Darwinian population, that is a population displaying phenotypic variation, heritability, and differences in fitness among its members. This requires reproduction, the existence of a parent-offspring lineage within the population, or lineages within the population. And where reproduction, or the existence of a lineage, involves the generation of a recurring structure via a distinctive kind of causal relation between parent and offspring. So reproduction then is going to be contrasted with reconstruction, where a structure recurs, but the causal relations between the things exhibiting the structure are simply not of the right kind. So that is, it's not the kind required for someone to count as parent and offspring, or for this to count as reproduction. And examples that Godfrey Smith points to here include things like organs, enzymes, ribosomes. But that said, the exact nature of the distinctive causal relation can differ in his account depending on whether the reproduction in question is collective, or simple, or scaffolded. And here we're going to be focusing just on collective reproducers. So that is on multicellular reproducers. So Godfrey Smith tells us that collectives or multicellular entities are clear or paradigm reproducers in virtue of the presence of three things. And so first, a bottleneck dividing generations, in which there's a shrinking down to a single cell or just a few cells. Two, a germ-soma distinction, with some components displaying reproductive specialization, being the parts that are responsible for the generation of a new collective. Three, collective integration, right, which involves a division of labour beyond that involved in the germ-soma distinction, mutual dependence of parts, and the maintenance of a boundary between the collective and what's outside. So that's just a very quick sketch of Dr. Smith's account. Now on to Purdue's physiological account. So according to Purdue, an organism's boundary depends on the activity of its immune system. So he writes, immunology strives to offer a criterion of immunogenicity, which is itself a criterion of individuality. The immune system, with its surveillance activity, defines what is accepted or rejected by the organism. A criterion of immunogenicity thus constitutes a criterion of inclusion. The distinction between entities that are interconnected and form a whole as constituents of the organism, and those that are rejected, is carried out by the immune system. Immunology allows for an understanding of the living thing's spatial boundaries and, by extension, determines which entities constitute its components. Okay, and the most explicit or concise statement of this criterion that he mentions there is the following. So he writes, my criterion demands both presence and inclusion, the absence of rejection. An entity is part of the organism only if it undergoes strong biochemical reactions with the rest of the organism, interconnection, presence, and constant systemic immune interactions of an ongoing average intensity with the immune receptors for inclusion. And though it says only if here, it's because that's what's at issue in this particular passage, but he endorses the other direction as well, so this is an if and only if. Now the wording of this partly reflects Purdue's continuity account of the function of the immune system, which is the focus of much of his 2012 book, The Limits of the Self, but the specifics of that account aren't relevant to what I'm going to say today. The key point is just that he sees the existence and constitution of organisms as grounded in the activity of the immune system. So that is the key thing, is just that his view is very roughly, there are various reasons why this is rough, but I'll do for now, that something is part of organism O, if and only if it is actively tolerated by O's immune system. Okay, building on this, he does also provide what he calls an immunological definition of a multicellular organism. And he writes that an organism is a functionally integrated whole composed of heterogeneous parts that are locally interconnected by strong biochemical interactions and controlled by constant systemic immune interactions of a constant average intensity. And one of the distinctive consequences of his sort of view, not this but the whole package, is supposed to be that many exogenous or genetically diverse entities, such as gut microbes, and parasites and fetuses, will therefore count as parts of organisms, right, on the basis that they are immunologically tolerated. And it's precisely that that's the locus of the apparent conflict between evolutionary and physiological accounts of biological individuality. So it's generally thought that according to evolutionary accounts, such as Godfrey Smith's, that exogenous entities like gut microbes are not parts of biological individuals. The sort of characterization that was given before is taken to more or less directly rule that out. And it's for this reason that many embrace pluralism. And one very clear statement of the sort of pluralism that we're considering, that I'm concerned with here, comes from John Dupre. He writes, the organisms that are part of evolutionary lineages are not the same things as the organisms that interact functionally with their biological and non-biological surroundings. The latter composed of a variety of the former. The biological entities that form reproducing and evolving lineages are not the same as the entities that function as wholes in wider biological contexts. Okay, while Dupre's conception of physiological individuality is one that gives metabolism pride of place rather than immunological tolerance, it shares with Purdue's the idea that exogenous entities like gut microbes are parts of organisms physiologically construed. I note that for ease of expression, I'm largely going to follow Dupre in using the word organism to cover both physiological individuals and multicellular evolutionary individuals. It's a bit of a vexed word, it just makes it easier to speak. We don't have to get too hung up on that, I don't think. But as common as endorsements of pluralism might be, I think it does face some difficulties. So first, there are a variety of metaphysical and epistemological puzzles concerning overlappers, or overlapping is familiar from the literature on personal identity. So, for example, both the evolutionary and physiological individual where you are appears to have what it takes to count as having the perspective you have. Right? They both have your brain as a part, but are there really two conscious beings where you are with duplicate perspectives? Which one are you? How could you know? And so on and so forth. People worry about these sorts of questions. Second, how pluralistic are we going to be? What's the stopping point? After all, there are multiple conceptions both of evolutionary individuality and of physiological individuality. Are we going to accept a variety of closely related but distinct evolutionary and physiological individuals? And this is to say nothing of the various other discussions in the literature that advertise themselves at least as providing distinct accounts of biological individuality, reproductive, developmental, historical, and so on. Third, there's a relatively immediate tension between the conception of the function of the immune system involved in the physiological account and the fact that evolutionary individuals have immune systems. Right? If organisms evolve to have immune systems, and if immune systems function to bring tolerated exogenous entities on board as part, then surely these tolerated exogenous entities must be part of the evolved organism. Alright, but I'm not going to press an argument against pluralism based on any of this stuff. I'm just raising them to show that we have some reasons to be wary, right? To ask ourselves whether its acceptance really is one is great. So to bring out why I think it isn't, I want to distinguish between two sets of questions. So on the one hand, we have mereological questions, questions concerning parts and wholes. So we might ask about parthood. Is some X part of an organism or part of organism O? Composition, we might ask, do the X's or do some X1 to Xn compose an organism? Compose organism O. On the other hand, we have non-mereological questions. So one's concerning organismality of a property of being an organism. So is this thing X an organism? Right? Or questions concerning realization. So does X, or do the X's or X1 to Xn being F, having some property F, realize or ground an organism being G? What interesting or relevant G's here might be existing, being part of a parent offspring lineage, being capable of undergoing selection, things like that. Right, now these are among the sorts of questions that we look to accounts of biological individuality to help us answer. And we want these accounts to tell us about the nature of organismic parthood, right, what it takes for something to be part of an organism. Or to tell us about the nature of organismality itself, what it is for something to be an organism, and so on. Right? So we've got these various questions, closely related, to be sure, not wholly independent, but distinct nonetheless. If we think back to the characterizations of the evolutionary account and the physiological account introduced a few minutes ago, hopefully it should already be clear that they relate to these sets of questions in different ways. Right, whereas the mereological questions were large, in the physiological account, they really weren't that salient at all in the evolutionary. We seem primarily interested in the non-mereological question concerning organismality. And I should say that questions concerning realization don't seem to be that salient in either, but they'll become relevant shortly. So I just want actually to consider the following possible combination of views that we can imagine someone might offer in attempting to answer questions concerning organismic parthood and organismality. So first, a physiological or immunological view concerning organismic parthood, right, according to which if some X is actively tolerated by an organism's immune system, then X is part of that. That's the part of the view that generated the apparent tension we talked about before. Second, an evolutionary view concerning organismality, according to which if O is a multicellular organism, then O is part of a parent offspring lineage, exhibiting a bottleneck, dividing generations, a germ distinction and inspiration. It's just taking the two kind of central components of the two views we talked about before. So these are supposed to be, I think on the face of it, in conflict. Right? And therefore to motivate pluralism. of the sort we talked about before. But why think this? Okay, so first, note that while Perdue did offer a definition of the organisms, which was all intended to build on his account of organismic part-body composition, and in order to speak to questions of organismality, we looked at it again. There's just really nothing in it that conflicts with this evolutionary characterization of multicellular organisms. But it seems like it could still be a true characterization for all that. I mean, maybe we wouldn't call that a definition. But of course, as noted before, the real locus of the conflict isn't in that characterization of organismality. It's supposed to be in the mereological questions, and particularly concerning the possibility of organisms having exogenous cells as parts. The claim that, say, a gut microbe is part of an organism is supposed to be in conflict with the consequence of this sort of evolution. But if we just look at the view, I think it's just not clear why that should be so. After all, let's suppose that a certain gut microbe is a part of this organism, right, here where I am, that this organism counts as having taken it on board as a part. Okay, and let's consider these three conditions on being an evolutionary individual. Well, it's still true that this organism emerged from a bottleneck, right? The picture is precisely one of something growing from a zygote by mitotic cell division and eventually taking on an exogenous thing as part. It's also still true that it exhibits reproductive specialization. It still has a germline in exactly the same way it does if we aren't supposing it has an exogenous part. Nothing about the supposition of this extra part forces us to change our judgment. And it's also still true that it displays the integration of the relevant sort. After all, part of the reason why physiological accounts want to take exogenous things, like gut microbes, to be parts of organisms is because they're integrated with the rest of the organism. Right? Recall that part of collective integration for Godfrey's myth was the maintenance of a boundary, and for Purdue's view, if the musis was precisely that it maintains such a boundary. So, where's the conflict? So, there is an explanation I want to offer here. I think the apparent conflict can be traced to implicit assumptions about recurring structure, specifically the structures that recur in reproduction, and about the realization question I mentioned, concerning the way in which certain properties of a whole organism are going to depend on or be grounded in the properties of its parts. Specifically, I think something like the following seems to be at work. So a principle like this: if some x is part of O, some O, and x doesn't have a structure that recurs in reproduction of an R, then O doesn't have a structure that recurs in reproduction of an R. And this is probably too crude for various reasons. Maybe other better ways to articulate the underlying thought. But the things that with this, right, I think we can see how there would be a conflict between the two views just proposed. For given that gut microbes are tolerated, the view concerning parthood implies that they are parts of the organism. Right? But as a matter of empirical fact, the organism's reproduction, this organism's reproduction doesn't itself generate gut microbes via mitotic cell division from the zygote, because it doesn't cause the recurrence of their structure in the relevant way. The gut microbe structure doesn't thereby recur. And so it follows by this principle that the organism in question doesn't have a structure that thereby reproductively recurs either. But, that's precisely what the evolutionary account wants to say about organisms, that they are reproducers of the relevance. So if we have some principle like this implying that the organism with the microbes as parts doesn't itself reproduce, then whatever it is that does reproduce, because obviously something does, that must be something else, something lacking any such exogenous parts. And without something like this, it's just unclear to me why taking the gut microbe to be a part of the organism should imply that there's reproduction of the organism of the whole, only if there is, in some sense, reproduction of that microbiome. But the point I want to press about this, right, is just that this seems to be a fallacy of composition, right, or division, simply assuming that a property of a part must be a property of the whole, or vice versa. because it's considering what it is for something to instantiate a structure that recurs in reproduction. There's just no conceptual necessity in taking this to require every part of that thing to instantiate part of that structure and to have a structure that recurs as part of the whole structure. Or even to play an important role in realising the organism's instantiating that structure. So, I do have to admit that we don't get an explicit statement of anything quite like this, in the literature as far as I can see, but we do get some hints in that direction. So Godfrey Smith, for example, at one point writes, can there be organisms that are parts of organisms? Here I do not just mean that one organism might be found within the boundaries, but that it might be one of the parts that makes the larger system into an organism. So the context here, the question being addressed, isn't the issue I want to consider. The issue is that in explaining what he means, right, Godfrey Smith is equating being part of an organism with being part of what makes her an organism. And this seems to embody the idea that to be part of a certain sort of individual just is to be part of what makes it into an individual of that sort. And if so, then given the account of evolutionary individuals that he provides, we can see that this just isn't a million miles away from the idea that every part of an evolutionary individual must play a certain sort of direct role in realising or making it the case that the individual reproduces, or in making it the case that it instantiates a structure that recurs in reproduction. And what I'm suggesting is that this is, at the very least, optional. So what this does seem to require, there is a commitment to finding a principled distinction between an organism's parts to explain why some play a certain sort of role while others don't. But I think it's natural to think that endogenous parts play a special role in grounding or realising the existence of an organism on any. But if we imagine God disappearing my endogenous cells, I just disappear, essentially. But if we imagine God disappearing my exogenous symbionts, right, I may suffer, perhaps even die eventually, but I don't disappear in the same way. And it's plausible that what it is for this organism here to exist, right, in part, is for it to be centrally composed of cells that have come from a certain bottom. But then, given an evolutionary account of organismality, there's just little distance, if any, between this and the claim that endogenous parts play a special role in realising or grounding the reproduction and evolution-relevant properties of an organism, such as instantiating a certain reproductively recurring structure. So the picture is roughly something like anything with these particular parts organised in this particular way will count as having this reproductively recurring structure, even if it also has further exogenous parts. And this would mean that, for example, although a gut microbe has a structure, it can be part of a whole without its structure being part of the structure that has to recur in order for the whole to count as reproducing. Finally, I just want to quickly raise two very quick questions. So, first, isn't this just the familiar idea that holobionts can be evolutionary individuals or units of selection, which some voice a lot of skepticism about? And the answer is no. I don't think so, because that sort of view recognises a distinction between host and symbiont and holobiont, right? The idea that a holobiont is a unit of selection is still to turn on whether host and symbiont have a shared evolutionary fate, right, where this requires vertical transmission of the symbiont so that it can be thought to reproduce as a unit. But the present suggestion doesn't involve anything like this. In a sense, for the relevant cases, it collapses the distinction between host and holobiont, right? But doesn't take the symbionts being part of the whole to imply that it has that sort of role to play in the whole's reproduction. No vertical transmission, indeed no transmission of any sort, right, need play a role in explaining what it is for the whole organism to reproduce. But this phenomenon just doesn't need to extend to the reproduction or reconstruction of the symbiont. The last other question is, well, wouldn't the bottleneck requirement fail to be met by something with exogenous parts? because those parts didn't come from the bottleneck. This is sort of to reiterate something I said. Look, I think this is just no. Right? To think so is just another fallacy of composition. It's true that an exogenous thing that's come on board as a part didn't come from the bottleneck, but it doesn't imply that the whole didn't count as coming from the bottleneck. And indeed, the origin of the whole typically does differ from the origin of many of its parts. Okay, so very quick conclusion. There's a lot of questions or connections that haven't been addressed, still require sort of some thinking through. These are some of those things the group had this interaction. Questions about whether there are degrees of organismality, questions about the exact status of the relationship between the properties of evolutionary individuality and physiological individuality, or should put those to organismality. Whether there are other forms of pluralism, principal pluralism that are okay, whether organismality is multiply realisable, all these sorts of things. I haven't spoken to any of them. The main point I wanted to press is simply this, right? That it seems, at least conceptually, possible or coherent to harmonise what I say to be the central driving components of evolutionary and physiological accounts of individuality. And indeed, that given the tension that I mentioned earlier, this shouldn't be surprising, right? Because as I said, if we think of the immune system as functioning, this is an if, right? If we think of the immune system as functioning to bring some things on board as parts, and to chuck other things overboard. And if we think of collective reproducers as having evolved to stand immune systems, then, as I said, this seems to be exactly the sort of picture we should expect. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Now for comments, we have
Yeah. I'm not quite sure whether to read my comments or speak them. And probably the conflict between the two of those motives will truly screw me up. But I think this is a good contribution to the whole Lamont literature in that sense, and you should probably go ahead and publish the paper that you sent me. True. I mean, I think it's a good paper. There have been for those of you that haven't followed the whole Lamont literature, there's been an enormous number of papers recently, mostly in the pages of biology and philosophy, but otherwise too, addressing this issue and addressing the overlap with this issue of the question of biological individuality, because it's obviously very important. It's in terms of natural selection, if nothing else, and Scott Gilbert et al. Just published a paper in 2012 called "We Have Never Been Individuals," which is sort of the notion that Alex was trying to express, and I think that's true. And it's interesting too, because I think that much of the philosophy of biology, at least, has been addressing, things that thought they were individuals. Like us, for instance, and suddenly we realize that our microbiome is actually very important to us in many ways, developmental ways and mental ways even. So we're not individuals in that same sense that we have classically thought of ourselves as being, and I think we're still dealing with that issue. So you have some specific questions about your paper, and I realize that this is way too long in my comments, so I'm going to truncate them, but I do have a handout which I think explains what we're after here. And partly it was the question what you mean by pluralism. So I guess maybe that's the question. What do you actually mean by pluralism? So I looked it up on Wikipedia, the source of my knowledge generally. And pluralism is a term used in philosophy. The term has different meanings in metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, and logic. So I don't know what the fuck meaning you're talking about here, really. So that's my first question. And I think, I think Peter Guthrie Smith has got it very clear in some ways. I mean, so if we look at biological individuals as the pluralistic term, then it encompasses both organism-like individuals and Darwinian-like individuals, and they overlap in precisely those areas where philosophy of biology has cut its teeth, basically. Multicellular eukaryotes. But in fact, there are Darwinian individuals that are not organisms, and there are organisms which are not individuals, Darwinian individuals. So I think he's quite clear about that, and I think that you would accept that too, basically. So that's. In fact, I think you're. So my second question, I guess, has to do with the similarity between your work and your paper and your presentation and the work of Van Wittem et al., which is basically quite different. I mean, it has to do with, I think they call it community genomics and evolution or something like that, or community ecology and evolution or something like that. And basically what they're saying is that if you look at so the particular system that they work on is cottonwoods and the insects associated with the cottonwood tree. But if they look at variants within the cottonwood species for different alleles of things, then different species will be accumulated by that particular cottonwood depending upon what allele it has. So they want to promote this as a evolutionary mechanism, and I think it's quite similar to the mechanism that you're talking about in the sense that something which is not a Darwinian individual is nevertheless part of the development of an organism in such a way that it becomes part of that individual. And so in a paper that we recently published in PNAS, criticizing Tom Whittam's approach, we basically said that they're conflating evolutionary biology and ecology, basically. And I think that's what they're doing, and I think that's what you're doing too. But I mean, I think it's okay. I mean, it's an interesting avenue to pursue. And the final thing, so that would be the question, which you probably haven't had a chance to look at those comments yet, because I sent them last week. The third comment, which is one I made to you at the International Ish, whatever it was, is about Prideaux. I mean, I really like Thomas Prideaux and all that sort of thing, but I think his concept of biological individuality only fits things with immune systems. So prokaryotes don't have immune systems, and for all the talk about CRISPRs being their equivalent to immune system, so people will say that. Many prokaryotes don't actually have CRISPR systems. So are they not individuals then? So immunology the immune system can't be a definition of individual in the same way that Thomas Prideaux would like it to be. Again, I think this is a legacy from the history of biology and philosophy, where the focus has been really on multicellular sexual eukaryotes. But those are my comments.
All right, great.
So there are 2 questions there.
Sorry, there are three
questions.
Yeah. All right, great.
5 minutes to respond, though. We've got, you're a little under, so you can take a little bit more time.
Okay, yeah, I'll try and speak to them directly. So yeah, thanks very much for sending them in advance. I'll address them in order, and I think what I want to say about the first one says something about the second, although I'm not so sure, but we'll see. So yeah, this is very helpful. The main question is, what do I mean by pluralism? Right? I mean, as I put it, certainly don't just mean that there's these 2 concepts or properties with different but overlapping extensions, right? I mean, that might be what I think some people have meant by it. But the particular sort of thing that I was concerned with was understanding that in a certain sort of Whereas understanding a view that ends up saying that there's a thing in one of these circles here and a thing in the other, and not just a thing at the intersection of the essentially both properties. So if you remember the Dupre quote, he's quite clearly saying that in a case like ours, there's both something that's an evolutionary individual, but that's simply a part of the thing that's an organism. Right? So it's not just something in the intersection. There's a thing here that's part of a thing. There's a thing here that's part of a thing there. Right? Okay. So, and actually this is useful for me to sort of say, because you say that you think the sort of Goffey-Smith's got it right in this sort of diagram. And in a way, I'm happy with the diagram and the way it sets out logical space. But what I'm sort of interested in, I think, in effect, is like the way in which he reasons about the locations of things in this diagram. Because he sort of says when it comes to us, he wants to put us in the intersection. Right? A human organism is both an evolutionary individual, a Darwinian individual, and it's an organism we call something a physiological individual. But he then says when he's talking about Purdue and Brain, people like that, that if we did want to say that this organism here has got microbes as parts, then they would be in this bit of the diagram. And he says a few other things about that sort of thought, but it's that assumption that I'm trying to target. And I'm saying, well, what reason do we have to accept that? And the kind of view that I'm trying to make space for, the thing I'm trying to say is coherent here, is one according to which there could be something which belongs to a single species, right, which counts itself as a reproducer engaging in good old single species reproduction, right, despite having some exogenous entities which themselves belong to other species as parts. Because Goffey-Smith's assumption is that, like, well, for this thing that he's saying is going to be over here, if that were going to be in the intersection, it would have to be engaging in what we might call like multi-species reproduction, like co-reproduction, right, of host and symbiote. And the thing I'm trying to suggest is that, as we might put it, not only is multi-species composition compatible with not being a reproducer at all, so that's being the hollow bias that you put it here, and perhaps compatible with being a multi-species reproducer, if that kind of thing does occur or not, people debate that. The point is that multi-species composition, as I'm calling it, is in principle, conceptually, compatible with being a single species reproducer. Right, or to put it another way again, right, having picked out a single species evolutionary individual, right, there's just a conceptual difference between, on the one hand, saying, well, this thing is part of a larger collective that includes a bunch of symbionts in addition, right, a hollow biont about which we can then have a debate about whether it counts as an evolutionary individual as well. So that on the one hand, and on the other, proposing that the very single species in evolutionary individual, has a variety of exogenous things as parts, but they're two different claims. Right? And it's this second thing that I'm trying to bring into view as a conceptual possibility. Right? As to and then, so does that sort of speaks to the second thing, maybe? And I don't think I did have a read through the Gilbert paper and then your response, although it's always difficult for me engaging with true biology because of my background, but I sort of think that I not necessarily want to disagree with your criticisms of that kind of view. I'm just not sure exactly how to relate them to this thing that I'm suggesting should be considered a genuine conceptual possibility that we might want to think about some cases in terms of. And so that's not very satisfying, of course, the second question, but that's sort of. It seems that what I want to say as a possibility is compatible with what you want to say in response to Gilbert. As far as I can see, but that might just that requires further thought, I think. And then the final thing is just like about Purdue, and you raised some challenges to his view, immunological view about what it is to be an organism now. particularly for the idea that it might be extendable to unicellular organisms. And those points are well taken. I myself don't want to defend Frederick's general view about the nature of organisms at all. My focus is just on a particular aspect of his view, the one that he shares with other physiological accounts of thinking that can be.
You do say that.
Sorry?
You do say that.
Right, yeah. So I think you might, those challenges I welcome. I don't want to suggest that his views are completely correct.
It might be targeted for control.
Yeah, which I think, a good point worth making. But actually, and in fact, for the record, I'm not myself necessarily even inclined to argue that exogenous entities such as gut bacteria are parts of us, right? My aim in the talk is just to argue that accepting that, if you thought there were good reason to think we should treat those as parts of the bigger thing here, that needn't rule out thinking of the bigger thing, or about being evolutionary Darwinian individuals as well, understood, as Godfrey Smith understands. Okay, that's... Yes, I hope that wasn't too long.
No. Thank you very much. Questions? Or comments?
Well, the question, but I don't think it's particularly a particularly groundbreaking question or anything like that. It's just a kind of curiosity. So what's to be gained by being sort of fairly promiscuous with the term individual? What's to be gained, say, methodologically or epistemologically, let alone ontologically, in saying, well, we can, if we're looking at just kind of evolutionary lineages or reproducers, then these things count as individuals. If we're thinking of, holobionts and the interesting facts about them, they count as individuals in another sense. And if we're thinking about something else, we can call that an individual, and we can subscript all of these, and we can be very clear, I suppose, we can be very nice and kind of hygienic in the way we talk about things, because we know what we're talking about when we use the term individual, because it's going to be one of these kinds or one of those. But what's to be gained in anything other than a pure... why have the same term? It's not like there's any great analogies between these different senses. It's not as though there's some pressing methodological or scientific or epistemological reason why you didn't want to use the term individual. Well, why not just keep the term individual special for a particular kind of metaphysical conception, not produced, that's some other one. And then just, when we talk about holobionts, we're talking about some kind of system or collective or collection of individuals, and then we can, build up our conceptions of these other things from individuals. We start with the individuals. It's very classical because we start with the individuals, and then the only things that really do count as individuals, and we build up our kind of biological ontology, as it were, from there. And we can show how the others are derived from that, rather than just kind of flatten it all out and say, yeah, these are one kind of individual, that's one kind of individual, and we can all be happy and pluralistic. What's the benefit in going down that road, if any?
Yeah, I don't like going down that route myself, so I'm very sympathetic to the question, right? It's, I think the question that comes to my mind in response to your question is, so what then are the things that you say, well, these are the basic building blocks, and then these are the individuals, the privileged ones, and of course we can think of collections of them, and we might want to say interesting things about certain collections of them, and predicate things in those collections, which will then go on and say they're individuals too. It's sort of like it's not very helpful to do that, and sort of water down or be pluralist, like used to that term. That seems fine. But then what are those things, right? Particularly the multicellular ones, right? Yeah. And what are their boundaries or something, right? And in some ways, part of what I'm sort of trying to do might ultimately lead to wanting to argue that the people who think that we should treat symbionts as parts of a unit, conceptualise that thing as a unit. I'm okay with ultimately saying that's a mistake, right? But what I'm sort of trying to argue is just if they were right, that we should think of these things as being parts of an individual in your privileged sense, right? Because once we're saying, well, there are going to be multicellular individuals, we have a question of their nature and questions about their composition, right?
Sure.
About the individuals properly considered. And I think people like to pray, well, he wouldn't be obviously this, yeah, he is. But I think Prideaux would want to say, no, the thing that I'm saying has these exogenous parts is an individual in whatever, like, the best sense of individual is. Right? And that's why there really is some sort of, like, tension, if you think that, between that and the kind of implicit view that people who endorse the evolutionary accounts have, where they think, no, the evolutionary individual definitely can't have like genetically diverse parts. It can't have exogenous parts, right? And you know, it might be that ultimately we want to say he's just wrong to think that the real individuals should be thought of as having these exogenous things as parts. But I'm kind of trying to, in some sense, restore the possibility of conflict between them by showing that they don't ipso facto, right? You know, if there is something useful, if there's a genuinely good reason to think of the thing including the exogenous symbionts as a unit, right? Because it plays a certain sort of really special role in certain sorts of biological explanations or theories. It's not that then, well, all what we have to do is sort of think that, well, there's that thing alongside the evolutionary individual. Because what we all think is going to be the evolutionary individual, basically, right? We can just say, because there's no incoherence in it, that, well, those arguments show that the evolutionary individual has these other things as parts, and that just doesn't require them thinking of it as a hollowed biont, i.e., if that's going to mean something, where there is like multi-species reproduction. So that's slightly wobbly, but I think
yeah, but I could say things in response, but I think maybe we might want to, I don't know whether I...
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask the same question.
Okay.
In this form.
Yeah.
Why not say that how you individuate, you have a choice of how to individuate things. If this choice works best for these questions, and that choice works best for those questions, then you're interested in both, relativized to what questions you're interested in. And I don't see that what you said in response to the first time this question was asked really addresses that. Here's another way to put it. Do it this, individuate this way, good for this questions, that way, those questions. What additional criteria for what counts as the correct answer to what the individuals are do you have in mind?
I'm not trying to get into the question of like, well, what individuals are there, right? But like, there's not a completely general answer to that, right? But trying to make sense as far as I can of, I'm not sure that I completely get what view you're sort of driving at as like the reasonable view. You're like, well, you know, you want to ask these questions relative to them, you're individuating things that way. Is there a single thing that you're thinking, well, when I ask these questions, I say, it has these parts or these boundaries. And then when I ask these questions, I'm going to say, it has these slightly different parts or boundaries.
I didn't put, oh, sorry.
Or is the thought that, well, look, when we ask these questions, we're talking about one thing. When we ask these questions, we're talking about this other thing. They're closely overlapping, but so that which one of those is the thing you're suggesting?
Neither.
Neither.
Right. You have a choice about how to individuate things. Relative to these questions, this choice works well. Relative to those questions, those choice well. And I suspect that independent of relativity to what you're interested in, there are no, so Eddie, you haven't given us any standards for making a further choice.
So, but there's just, I'm suggesting that a certain question about the relationship between those things is a coherent question, right? Assuming that when you do it one way, the thing you're talking about, we're not being idealist here, the thing you're talking about exists. Right? And when you do it another way, the thing you're talking about exists.
We need to talk in more detail. I don't want to go on too long and get to the next question.
Okay, maybe we need to talk about details.
This time.
I mean, I'm happy to keep running, but yeah, let's move on to other questions.
Right. Just a brief more question of understanding, perhaps. If I look at a gut microbe and take a look at your evolutionary definition of an individual, or a set of gut microbes maybe, then according to that, that's not just an extraneous part, that there's an individual in itself. Surely it reproduces, it has like a lineage, blah, 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 and it surely has evolution in its own. So that's an individual, and then I can be like, look at myself, maybe just undergone radiation therapy, so I have no gut microbes, or whatever I did to achieve that, and if I'm at least thick enough, I can still reproduce, have a lineage, and so on, right? So I'm an individual. So you're kind of not just saying, this thing is reproducing and it has a part that is kind of not part of that. You're kind of saying this is an individual that has individuals, something like that. So I think that is actually a conflict with the idea of, no, there's a single individual.
Where's the conflict?
Well, the meaning of individual seems to me like it's kind of one thing, if that makes sense. I don't know what.
Yeah, but I mean it is.
But you know, you have an individual within individuals. Okay. So you're just good with that. You're going like, well whatever. So
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I agree that people sort of seem maybe perhaps a resistance. I mean, it's not true that for any predicate you can't.
The thing is, if I stand next to you and we're drawing a line around saying, now this is an individual, like us two, we go like, no, that's two people. Just because they're kind of like associated in spatial proximity, they're not one individual. They're two individuals that happen to stand close to each other.
But
right?
the people who are defending like the physiological accounts of individuality, which again, obviously, I'm not asserting myself that those are correct.
Right.
But as I suppose their arguments were good, their arguments say this thing, right? Because of its functional integration with the larger thing, we should think of it as part of that thing.
Okay.
Right? That's their sort of view.
Yes.
Right?
And you're trying to resolve that conflict, and I'm saying I think it's a real conflict. It's actually a problem. So your argument is that it's not a problem.
No, but yeah.
Basically, right?
It's not, but we need to say why is it a problem? And part of the problem has been thought, well, the thing you're saying is a part of, I also want to say that's an evolutionary individual that's going to be a reproducer and is meant to fit the sort of account that we're given. And I'm saying, in fact, it still does fit that account, even if we assume that this thing is part of it. You're sort of raising another sort of issue. So, well, if we're going to say it's part of this individual, don't we have to say it's not an individual? I mean, why? It's
so
not
it's kind
thing.
of like, well, I have difficulty with the concept of like a babushka doll type of individuality, where you can have individual stuff. I mean, I don't know. I just find it not a very natural way of talking about.
The word individual is doing you. I mean, it's a thing. It's a thing that has an identity that we can trace its history, right? And that has all these other things that are interestingly true of it. But none of those things, like, obviously issue in a conflict with saying, well, when it is appropriately functionally integrated in something. I mean,
well, but
is it because they're the same kind?
No, you make a different kind of definition of individual, and maybe then it works. But what I'm trying to say is with the physiological definition, you have something as an individual, with the other one, you have... Anyway, it's not because there was one more question.
We have like 4 minutes left. I'm gonna... do you have a really pressing question?
It's kind of a variation on some things already been said, so go ahead.
I might use my privilege as a chair and insert my own question. if that's okay. I have a different line of question for you. Or that would be unrelated to just pressing you on why is individuality. So yeah, I think these might amount more to comments. So I noticed at a couple points, so in Godfrey Smith's 3-tiered account of evolutionary or Darwinian individuals, you were focusing on a collective, but he also has simple and scaffolding, right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering, it seems like, and possibly, because again the terminology gets really confusing, but sometimes, right, in his account, once you move down to simple, are individual. That seems to be more like your paradigmatic E. coli bacterium that composes my gut microbiome, right? And there, the criteria is going to look different because you're not going to have bottlenecks and stuff like that anymore. So for Godfrey Smith, those are still going to be evolutionary individuals, but he's not going to want to say they're organisms or anything that can. Or he's going to say they're evolutionary individuals, but they're not. They don't have the bottleneck criterion in the same way, or the germ soma.
Well, not what we saw.
Yeah. So when
It's good. We don't want to say they're organisms.
well, yeah, but of the evolutionary variety, right? So I wonder if.
No. So go finish.
Oh, yeah. Well, I wonder if there was some slippage in terminology there, right? So when you move from his account of a collective individual to his account of a simple reproducer, he's still treating those as important evolutionary units.
Mm-hmm.
But once you move down to the simple reproducer, a lot of the things that his account's no longer going to be an important target because now you're looking at a different tier in the same way that if I move down to viruses, right? He's going to say that, hey, those are still doing important. We want to count those as evolutionary units, but the way they act is really different. And I can expand on that later. I'm not sure. It might just be a terminological problem that I wasn't following in your talk. So you might be.
The terminology is very slippy, but
and then I'll follow up with one other thing.
Okay.
Same thing I think happens. So when you talk about multi-species, multiple species going on, well, right, some of the literature species as individuals too. So if you buy into that now, just moving up to say that, well, this thing's composed of multiple species, some people are going to want to say that those species are individuals. And now, I don't know if that would bring any issues.
I'm not sure about the second one, because even if you think of species as individuals, there's a distinction between the individual species and the things that we will know as like members of that species, right?
Well,
part to whole, right?
But so Hull and the individuality thesis, they actually argue against that it's not members of a set. Yeah, right.
That's why I said things that we ordinarily speak of as members of the species, right? Yes, I get they're related to part to whole, right?
Yeah.
So what it is to be a member of the species is to be a certain sort of part of the individual that is the species, right? But the multi-species composition of individuals that I was talking about before is where you have the things that are related as kind of the privileged first set of parts of the individual species whole, and interestingly related to something else that bears that part of the relationship between the species. So it's not about relationship between the species, even though we're calling it the individual species, even though we're calling it. It's still a relation between what we ordinarily call members of the species. Of course, there's people who conceptualizing the nature, metaphysical nature of that relationship.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that's necessarily an issue.
I think.
Well, maybe I should.
We're outside. Yeah.
I'll come back because of the.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
No, thanks very much for the comments. So slightly waffly answers, but I feel it's very helpful.
Yeah. But of course.
And they replicate completely.
Yeah.
Coffee?
So maybe I think more actually doing
Same here.
I'm always
I'll get what? I'll be here.
Yeah, actually, I mean, back to
good.
I'll go with you. Get a couple of things as well, but I don't know. I mean, I have
Kind of like on holiday. I mean, we're taking off. I think we're taking off because we have to leave in the morning. Right?
So you have to check out at what's today? Yeah, on Saturday. Check out 10:30 a.m. Check out So I don't know if people are going to dinner tonight or whatever. I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm not much one way or the other.
Well, yeah, but if there's something comes up, what I don't quite know is how we're going to deal with the lunch break. Is will there be like a room where we can lock it?
Well, if you're not
Probably
Tomorrow.
Yeah, we probably just
Saturday, maybe.
just in reception.
You really are saying the same thing.
Oh, I'm happy to.
So
technically it's not very big.
Yeah, but then you can't go for food, basically.
So I did have a look at
Yeah, reception. There'll be a security.
Look at that paper.
I was going to go slow. But no, I mean, I'm happy to go and get something from you.
Yeah.
That's just
So just thinking of for how much I have to shop, but I guess it's just for one day, right? Because Sunday will not need it. You don't want to have leftovers to carry along.
Us having lots of.
No, I just get a couple of things.
You said there wasn't a supermarket in the other place.
I haven't seen any other
Human
one.
beings, but.
There may be one somewhere hidden away, but I haven't found one.
Yeah.
Although,
That's where the second.
you might know.
Comes in.
True. Local.
Right.
I mean, if some people come out for dinner, I'll join them, but I'm not going to go hunting around shooting about it.
Yeah, I've already spent again for the day. This was like 30
Well, that's the thing.
$30.
I have to go to the supermarket, go to the gym again,
They
Yeah.
can't
just work
do
that.
that
Super fast.
by the normal.
Yeah.
For that?
Because they don't reproduce together. So, but I do think that what you're saying is interestingly related to what Tom Whittam and all are saying about ecology, basically, which is it's sort of Dawkins' extended phenotype, basically. I mean, you're saying that the alleles in the cottonwood affect what insects colonize the tree, and obviously they do. But it's suddenly ecology, because it can be fixed within the cottonwood species, whatever allele and then it's fixed within the, long been fixed within the insect species, it's attracted to those cottonwoods. So it's ecology, right? It's an evolutionary biology. So I think that's what you're going to do, is you're saying that yes, indeed, there's a causal relationship between organisms.
Yeah.
Certainly there is. Based on ecological relationship.
And you're saying, essentially, you're saying conceptually, that's not problematic if I'm treating these as equivalent units.
Yeah, I think you can do that. I mean, it's just this. I mean, I would fight against it, but you could do it. You can do it.
But is that your claim? I just want to make sure I follow.
I'm not sure what you mean by treating units units.
Okay.
I mean, what is those claims about that causal relationship? Don't want to imply anything very logically one way or the other, right? And the physiological account people think that certain causal relationships imply certain biological claims. Right?
Yeah.
My point is that if you were to, not on a basis of it being an evolution relationship, right?
Right. I mean, that's where the overlapping ellipses of Peter Smith make sense, because polar ions are outside. They're outside the overlap. But humans as just me is inside the overlap, and that's what we used to think. That the microbes didn't matter or whatever, but not that we do think the microbes matter. So we put the polar ion concept, and now those are not.
Anything you guys are thoughts?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. Fresh. Thank you. All right. We would now like to welcome Matthew Tugby, and he is giving a presentation titled "Function, Goals, and the Problem of Goal Failure." And are you set? You need. You're good. Okay. Then.
Right. Thank you, everybody, for choosing my talk. and thanks to Joao for some really good comments that we'll get onto later. So the work that I'll talk about today is from a project on teleology, and the starting point for the project was thinking about functions, but for reasons I'll explain in a moment, the project became more about goal-directedness, because I kind of realised that you really needed to get a grip on the notion of goalhood and goal-directedness in order to actually understand functions. So the project ended up being more about goal-directedness than functions, even though functions was the starting point. And the gist of what I'm going to argue today is this, that some of the people who, like me, think that the concept of function and goals are closely connected. A lot of those people are reductionists about goal-directedness, and here I'm talking about people like Ernest Nagel and some early cybernetic theorists who I'll describe in more detail later. And they had a kind of behaviouristic, mechanistic, reductionist notion of goal-directedness. And they use that as a basis then for their theory of functions. But I found that I disagreed with the kind of reductive nature of their analysis of goal-directedness. And I'm going to want to explain why today. And it's to do with a problem that I call the problem of goal failure. And just to jump to the end, to give you a flavour, the idea is that really I think in order to accommodate a notion of goal-directedness that's robust enough to account for functions, you need to be a kind of anti-reductionist about goal-directedness. So it's got a kind of a radical thesis in a way. I'm going to argue that there are actually teleological properties that are irreducible out there in the world. So I guess it's kind of got an Aristotelian flavour to it, but I think you can accept a lot of what I say without buying into a lot of Aristotle's metaphysics. So it might sound like quite an old-fashioned view, but I'm going to try and give some kind of modern-day arguments for it. So that's the overall shape of the talk. I said I'd just start with the idea of functions, and function talk, of course, is pervasive in everyday life and in the special sciences, particularly biology. We'll probably come on some examples later. A very simple everyday example of a function is, say, the function of a knife to cut, or the function of a thermostat to maintain a certain temperature. We're all familiar with these kind of terms, right? And but the problem is when you try to give a philosophical analysis of them, you find that there are different kinds of functions, and to give a catch-all analysis isn't that easy. For example, philosophers of biology often talk about a kind of selectionist theory of function. So to work out whether an item is a function or not, you kind of have to look at the causal history, and if it's been selected for a particular effect that it has, and if that causes it to be propagated through time, then in biology we would say, yeah, that's definitely a function. And that's a kind of, as I say, a selectionist historical view. But it's not clear that that kind of deals with all the cases, because people think often there are cases of functions which aren't selected for. An interesting example from biology again is, for example, the flippers on sea turtles. They now seem to use them for quite an important reason of digging egg holes for their eggs. But of course, and that seems like a function, right, because it's important to their reproduction and survival as a species. But of course the flippers, as far as we know, weren't selected precisely for that reason. It was more for the swimming abilities. So that maybe is an example of a case of a function that isn't naturally selected. And then it leads people to give other various theories. There's something called a causal role view, which is a very more simple view. It just says that an item has a function if it contributes a kind of causal contribution to an overall effect of the system. And that's quite a liberal notion of function. You end up saying that all sorts of things are functions just in case they, happen to make a contribution to some bigger effect. But that seems to leave you with too many functions in a way, so that's maybe guilty of overbreadth. For example, that view seems to imply that, say, the function of mist is to create rainbows and such like. So that seems to go the other way. While the selectionist view seems not broad enough, the causal row view seems to over-generate functions. So anyway, to get to the point, one way of kind of drawing the line in the right place is to appeal to the notion of goal-directedness. So that will rule out some of these cases that the causal role theory lets in, because of course it looks like it's not a goal of mist in any sense to kind of help to create rainbows. And it also helps with the kind of sea turtle case, because you can say, well, okay, the flippers weren't naturally selected for this hole digging function, but it's a kind of goal of the sea turtle to reproduce, and because the egg hole digging contributes towards that goal, that's a real reason why that's a function, despite not being naturally selected. So it seems to me, and this is really just background stuff, and I'm not going to argue for this in any more detail than I have already, but it looks like the notion of goal-directedness is important for accommodating functions. And this leads to what people often call the goal contribution account of function. I've got a short definition on the handout there. So if you buy into this view of functions, the idea is that x performs function y for system S if and only if the y-ing of x makes a causal contribution to a goal of S. Okay. So that's what got me thinking about goal-directedness. If you accept that analysis, it looks like you've got to understand goal-directedness in order to understand functional activity. And that kind of view has been put forward, I guess most famously by Ernest Nagel, the people like Christopher Bors. I'm going to focus mainly on Nagel's exposition of goal-directedness and then, as I said earlier, raise a problem for it. I described it earlier as having a kind of behaviouristic and reductionist aim. So really what Nagel wanted to do, he was happy to allow scientists to talk about goal-directedness, which obviously has a teleological flavour, but he wanted to show that that kind of language isn't indispensable. He wanted to show that you can give a kind of mechanistic definition of goal-directedness. So what he wanted to do is sort of allow us to talk about goal-directedness and therefore functions, but in a way that is kind of reductive. In principle, a biologist or any other scientist could do without these teleological terms, according to Nagel. Okay, so what was his analysis then? It has its roots actually in earlier work in the 1940s and 50s by a number of what we call cybernetic theorists, also some philosophers of biology. And the starting point really was noticing that certain machines kind of behaved a lot like the kind of focused, goal-directed behaviour that we find in biology. There seem to be some kind of parallels there. For example, if you think about a homing missile, it's highly adaptive and it will overcome obstacles in order to reach the end state that it's moving towards. And you can start it off in different positions and it will still take a causal path towards its goal. And it looks like that's really what's going on in biology as well. If you think about, for example, the water moderation system in a human being, what it does is it reacts to changes in state variables in a way that maintains a path towards a goal. So if the blood has to have a certain water content, if too much water comes in, the kidney will kick in and drain some of the water away. But if there's not enough water in the blood, the skin and muscles will release water back in. So what Nagel and others noticed is that in all these cases of what look like goal-directed behaviour, you have a kind of adaptability, and these systems can, as it were, modify their behaviour in the face of obstacles and interruptions. So how do we make this more precise then? Well, the idea is that we can define certain features of systems called plasticity and persistence. Again, some definitions on the handout. Roughly, a system we can say is plastic if a certain state S of the system is achievable via different causal paths or from different initial positions. Again, that comes out nicely in that homing missile example. You can set it off from different places and it will still home in on a target. And persistence is similar, but it's more to do with the adaptability of the behaviour as it arises. So, again, with the homing missile, if something gets in its way, it will go around it and it will kind of modify its behaviour in the face of interruptions and obstacles. So the cybernetic definition of goal-directedness then is just that a system is goal-directed if it displays plastic and persistent behaviour. And that's why I say it's a behaviouristic analysis at bottom, because you just have to look at the patterns of behaviour that the system exhibits in order to determine whether it's goal-directed or not. And notice that in the definitions of plasticity and persistence, I haven't really talked about goals or any of the teleological concepts. They're just to do with patterns of behaviour. So it looks, on the face of it, reductive, although this is something that Joao might question later. Okay, so why don't I like this view then, despite liking Nagel's goal contribution theory of functions? Well, there's a well-known problem called, well, I call it the problem of goal failure, sometimes called the problem of missing goals. And I'm not sure a satisfactory solution has really been found on Nagel's behalf. Here's why. So here's an observation from Scheffler and Nissen. This kind of behaviouristic, reductionist, mechanistic analysis of goal-directed behaviour is kind of a success-based analysis, because we have to witness the thing achieving its goal in order to say that it's goal-directed, and we have to witness it doing it from different initial positions, and we have to witness it modify its behaviour. But, part of that involves seeing it get to its end state after overcoming certain obstacles. So it's a kind of a success-based account of goal-directed behaviour. The goal-directedness supervenes on these patterns of success, of getting to the same end state from different causal paths. But here's the thing, and here's a quote from Nissen: "No provision is made on this theory for failing to realise the goal state, and it ignores the large amount of behaviour directed to goals never reached." So the conceptual point here is that it makes sense to talk about goal-directed behaviour in cases where the goal is never reached. If a homing missile kind of encounters too big an obstacle, or if the target has some impressive countermeasures, then it won't hit its target. But nonetheless, it seems coherent to say that its goal-directed behaviour was towards the target. So we need some way on the analysis of goal-directedness to account for failure of achieving goals. So what can we say here? Well, here's what would be a bad answer to this kind of challenge. Scheffler's own example of this problem of missing goals involves a dog. So the thought is that the dog is pawing at the door, right? So the idea is that this is goal-directed behaviour in some sense, although we haven't specified what the goal is, because it's kind of underdetermined, right? There's a door. So here's the full story. Sorry, the dog is pawing at the door, so it wants the door to be open for some reason or other, you would think. But in the example, the door never gets opened, so we never get to really find out what the dog is after. Could be looking for food, or might just want to be let out of the cage. So that's one of these cases where the goal doesn't, manifest. And then the question is, well, what is the goal directed towards then? Now, one answer that people have given is that, well, it's something to do with the dog's intention, right? That's the simple answer. The dog either intended to be fed or intended to leave the cave or whatever else. And that's what determines its goal-directed behaviour. You just need to invoke concepts like intention. But notice that that's not going to be a good solution in all cases, because the main reason behind the cybernetic project is to accommodate goal-directedness in purely kind of, non-mental, very simple systems like homing missiles. And surely a homing missile doesn't intend anything, it doesn't have the right kind of complexity for that. So this intention solution. It kind of works in the case that Scheffler talks about with the dog, but it can't be a general solution for pinning down goal-directedness in these failure cases, because we want to be able to accommodate many kinds of goal-directedness where there simply are no intentions to be had. Okay, so that's the problem then. So just for the last 10 minutes of the talk, I want to think about some other solutions and whether any of them work, and end with the solution I mentioned earlier, which is a kind of anti-reductive approach, which is to just say that goal-directedness is a kind of teleological state that can't be analysed in reductionist terms in the way that Nagel and others were looking for. Okay, here's a solution which someone like Nagel might find appealing, but I think it's ultimately problematic. Some commentators on this problem have suggested, there's a pretty obvious solution here. The problem with the purely behaviouristic view is that it's based on actual patterns of behaviour. And in order to solve this problem of goal failure, we need to think about counterfactuals, right? We need to think about what the thing would do if conditions would have been otherwise. So if somebody had have opened the door for the dog, what would it have done? If there's a counterfactual that tells us that, then we can kind of determine what the goal state was. So this then takes us to a counterfactual analysis of goal-directedness, which is still meant to be reductionist in flavour, because the idea is that we don't need to actually refer to goals in the analysis. So Nagel sometimes describes his view precisely in counterfactual terms, maybe for this reason. Here's a quick quote. When he's talking about the water moderation system that I mentioned earlier, he says, were the blood inundated with water to a greater or lesser extent than was actually the case, the activity of the kidneys or of the muscles and skin would have been appropriately modified. So this then allows that even if the moderation process doesn't get completed, we can still say what the goal was because of this kind of counterfactual. Okay, so this is going to work then as a nice solution. I think there are going to be problems, and this is where things get quite complex, but I'll just try to give you a flavour of what kinds of problems will arise. Let's go back to the dog case then. So remember the dog is pawing at the door. We want to say that behaviour is goal-directed, but it's kind of underdetermined what the goal is because the door never gets actually open. Well, what we could kind of stipulate that, the dog wanted to leave the cave, and we capture that with a counterfactual. It just says if the door had been opened in various ways, then the dog would have found a way to exit the cave. So there's your counterfactual that captures what the goal of the behaviour was. But here's a problem. What we would have to do is try to make sure that the counterfactuals always lined up perfectly with what the goals really were. And this is where there's going to be room for counterexamples, right? So in my example here, imagine that the door gets open, the dog feels that it's really cold outside, and just decides not to go out after all. Now the goal in pouring at the door, let's assume, was to be let out of the cave, but then the dog just kind of changes its mind in this counterfactual scenario where the door gets opened. So that's a case where the counterfactuals delivered the wrong verdict. So then we're starting again now of kind of counterexample, modification, counterexample, and it gets messy. So I'm not going to dwell much longer on this. What tends to happen is when you try to modify these kinds of counterfactuals, and you see this a lot in the dispositions literature when they're trying to give counterfactual analyses of dispositions, the modifications that you make tend to make the analysis circular. Okay. So in the dog example that I just described, where it's really cold outside and the dog decides not to leave after all, you might say, well look, this is a counterfactual which tells us what's going on and tells us what the goal of the original behaviour was. We can say that if the door were opened and the dog's goal were not altered, then the dog would exit the cave. So we're stuck in a proviso to make sure that the counterfactual lines up with what the goal really was. But then we've just stuck in a circular proviso. What we're trying to do is give a counterfactual analysis of goals and goal-directed behaviour, that the new proviso appeals to the concept of a goal. So I'm not hopeful really that there is a good counterfactual solution to be found, and as I say, it's complicated, but please take my word for it for now, and then we'll see where to go from there. I'll just say one thing briefly. There is another solution to this problem of missing goals, which some cyberneticists have tried out, but I see it as quite a radical solution that doesn't really seem very plausible to me. But here I'm talking about people like Adams and Faber, and what they thought is that as well as plasticity and persistence, what we need is another condition which says that a truly goal-directed system represents its own goal to itself. So it's kind of, in some way, has an inner representation property which really determines what the goal of the system is. If you think about a simple example like a thermostat, maybe you would say that, you know, the dial is pointing up at a particular temperature, and that kind of tells you what the goal is, even if the thermostat later breaks and doesn't end up reaching that temperature that was on the dial. But if we take this idea literally, and I think these people really do want to take it literally, we are literally saying that, you know, these very simple mechanisms like thermostats are representing goals to themselves. And that, as I say, just seems radical. I mean, I don't have any deep arguments to offer right now on this, because I just think it looks like a non-starter. But, I mean, one of the reasons is that if a thermostat is going to represent the goal to itself, and the goal doesn't exist, then it looks like there has to be some kind of intentionality built in. So you're going to end up with this really radical thesis, which is that, you know, the thermostat is in a kind of intentional state towards its goal. So yeah, I won't say any more about that, but I just think it's quite a radical way to go, and I don't think you need to go quite that far. Okay, so I'll finish with my positive proposal then. I've got 5 minutes. So I think there's lessons to be learnt actually from the dispositions debate, which I mentioned earlier, because a similar... I mean, what's been interesting for me is I work a lot on dispositions, as a lot of you probably know. But then when I started doing this project on teleology, I saw that a similar kind of debate arises in this kind of goal theoretic literature, which actually predates the disposition stuff. The counterfactual analysis of dispositions kind of came on the scene, I guess, in the 90s mainly. But people were talking about, this problem of missing goals and these counterfactual solutions. So this other area of debate is from kind of the 1960s and 70s. It's kind of interesting that a lot of similar things went on, and a lot of dispositionalists, I don't think, actually realised that there was this whole debate that was very structurally similar in teleology. But anyway, let's see if there's anything to be learned, from the way that the dispositions debate panned out. And really, to cut a long story short, because of the difficulties of giving a counterfactual analysis of dispositions, what we started to find is a lot of thoroughgoing realists about dispositions came on the scene, and they started trying to resist these reductive analyses in terms of counterfactuals, and just treating dispositions as real, irreducible properties that things have. And this led to a kind of an explosion of work on powers in the 90s and onwards. So realists about dispositions, a lot of them call these irreducible properties powers, so that's just a terminological point. And powers are just, in a way, teleological states. I know David puts it in those terms, and I have in a few places. Because the thing about, if you're going to say that a disposition is an irreducible property, then, and then also the fact that dispositions are individuated by what they are dispositions for, it looks like an irreducible power would have to be some kind of state of directedness towards a potential manifestation. And this is what people like George Molnar, for example, have pushed, that really the essential feature of a power is this irreducible end-directedness or finality towards a manifestation state. Okay. So what then? So that's how things have panned out over there. So what then if we make a similar move in this goal-directed debate? How would that pan out? Well, if we want to go in that direction, and I do because I am a powers theorist in the dispositions area, so it would make sense to me to make a similar move over here. The idea would be that, we view states of goal-directedness a lot like powers. So if powers are teleological states, we can think of states of goal-directedness as being, again, teleological states. But unlike powers, or normal powers, they only emerge at certain levels of complexity. So you're not going to get, like, a stone on the floor. That's not going to be a goal-directed system because it doesn't display those plastic and persistent behaviours that I described earlier. But the idea is that when you get to a certain level of organisation, it's appropriate to think of there being something like a power, which is a state of goal-directedness, as I put it. And then, just to show how this helps with this problem of goal failure, the idea is just that, the goal that the state of goal-directedness is pointing towards just is built into the nature of the property. It's a state of directedness. It's a teleological property. I know this is radical, so a lot of people probably won't like it, but here's what I want to emphasise. It ain't that easy to be a reductionist about goal-directedness. The obvious way to go is either like a behaviouristic analysis or a counterfactual analysis. But for the reasons I've given it's not easy, right? So what are the other options? Well, there aren't many, I think. If we really think that goal-directedness is an important notion in science and metaphysics, and I think it is, in part because it sheds light on functions, then we've got to somehow give an account of these phenomena. And if the reductionist projects fail, then it looks like you're going to have to accept goal-directedness as some kind of fundamental feature of the world, in the same way that powers are also fundamental. I'll just make one closing comment. I think I'm more or less out of time now. There's an interesting question for me, and I've not fully got my head around this yet, but could it be that states of goal-directedness just are a kind of power, a special kind of power that you get at a level of complexity? And I think there's some further interesting work to be done here, and I'm not sure exactly if I think all cases of goal-directedness are just cases of powers. One reason, quickly, that I've mentioned on the handout, a lot of people are suspicious of the idea of a dispositional power that's directed towards an impossible manifestation. So if you think about, the power to prove some mathematical theorem which is false, or the power to travel faster than the speed of light, that sounds a bit weird, right? Surely a power is something that is possible to bring about. On the other hand, it seems that in some cases of goal-directedness, you might want to allow that there are impossible goals. So, is there anything really wrong with saying that someone in a spaceship has the goal of travelling faster than the speed of light, and if they're really trying to push down on the accelerator? Maybe that's not so incoherent. So maybe that's a case of goal-directedness which isn't a power. But as I say, I'm not quite clear yet on the relation between power-directedness and goal-directedness. Maybe one is a special case of the other, or maybe there are some examples of goal-directedness which are just their own kind of teleological property. Okay, so to summarise then, people like Nagel, that they see that the concept of goal-blood and goal-directedness is important. But when they try to analyse that in mechanistic or behaviouristic terms, it's not that easy. So, I just want to put on the table that we might think about these states of goal-directedness as being properties in their own right that aren't reducible. Right, I'll finish there. Thank you. Thank you.
And then we Silva. And I apologize if I butchered your name.
No, don't worry. Everyone misses it. Okay, so thank you for the paper. It was very good. I think I'll just read my comments, maybe to be easier that way. So, Tugby draws on recent work on the metaphysics of powers or dispositions to solve a problem found in the literature regarding goal-directedness. How do we explain goal-directedness when the system fails to achieve its goal? He starts by providing a valuable summary of the debate on goal-directedness, and he aptly notes that the goal contribution theory is to be preferred over role and etiological theories for avoiding the problem of overbreadth and of functions that were not obviously naturally selected. But the goal contribution theory suffers a problem of its own, which is explaining those cases when the system fails to achieve its goal. So my first problem is that this cybernetic theory of goals starts by noting that typical examples include homing missiles, homeostatic devices such as thermostats, or self-driving cars, because since they perform all sorts of adaptive, goal-directed behaviors that are also pervasive in biology, as when the human body maintains a temperature of 37 degrees in varying external conditions. Well, it seems to me that even if similar, biological and artifactual goal-directedness, such as the one we find in homing missiles, for example, are significantly different. For instance, in the case of artifacts, to use a rather Neo-Aristotelian analogy, there is nothing in its constituents that possesses an inherent capacity to act in a specific way. The constituents of the homing missile don't possess any inherent capacity for homing missiling, but that sort of goal-directedness seems to be dependent on the human maker, on whoever does the homing missile. And in the natural world, that is not the case. It seems like natural substances have their goal-directedness just inherent to them. It's not imposed from the outside, from a human maker, let's say. So my first question is, the cybernetic theory of goals treats biological goal-directedness as in the same way that it treats the goal-directedness found in artifacts. Do you make a distinction between both forms of goal-directedness? And if so, is that distinction the same as the latter distinction between goal-directedness and end-directedness that you do? Secondly, I have some comments regarding the cybernetic approach and its role in the argument. As I read it, the cybernetic analysis seems to be closer to scientific description than philosophical theory. You write that, according to this approach, functions and goals are to be explained in entirely non-teleological terms. But this does not seem to me to be the case. It rather seems that cybernetic theories, cybernetic approaches try to explain functions and goals without mentioning intentions, but not teleology, and this is important. For instance, saying that the behavior of the system is directively organized towards a certain end hardly avoids teleology, just intentionality. I thus worry that plasticity and persistence presuppose goal-directedness rather than explaining it. You clarify that on the surface, these concepts of plasticity and persistence are empirical and therefore testable. So is this testability what is supposed to rule out teleology? Is this what makes it not teleological? I would instead argue that such testability only confirms the goal of the system instead of explaining it, without employing teleological terms. This, of course, does not go against Tugby's thesis. If anything, it strengthens it. You'll later worry that appealing to intentions may plague these theories with forms of teleology that they intend to avoid. I just think that problem can already be witnessed in the concepts of plasticity and persistence. Lastly, I have some questions related to your use of end-directedness and goal-directedness. I think that in the talk you actually only used goal-directedness, not end-directedness, but in the paper you use it too. The difference seems to be that the first, that is end-directedness, is teleological, whereas the latter, goal-directedness, is not. But you later say that goal-directedness is just a special case of end-directedness, that we find at certain levels of complexity. I just have some questions. So first, if end-directedness is more basic than goal-directedness and inherently teleological, isn't goal-directedness also teleological? As such, what is the difference between the two? Is this a difference in kind or a difference in degree only? And at what levels of complexity do we start finding goal-directedness behavior instead of merely end-directedness behavior? I think that's it. I got another question during your talk that you may want to address. So you said that mist doesn't have the goal of producing a rainbow, and that seems to be okay. I have no problems with that. But I think it would be okay to say that it has a disposition to produce a rainbow. So what is the difference there between disposition and goal? That's it. And thank you for the paper again.
Thank you. All right. Now open the floor for questions. That's right. Thank you.
It's that time of day.
No, sorry, no response. I apologize. 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, thanks for all the great questions. I don't know if I can have the time to give detailed answers, but I mean, for Nagel certainly wants to say that both organisms and these artifacts are goal-directed, and it's for him it's to do with the way the systems are organised. Okay, and it's the organisation which gives rise to the plasticity and persistence. So he's trying to find commonalities in structure that allow us to call both cases of goal-directedness. Well, but one thing he does say is that goal-directedness for him comes in degrees. So one system can be more plastic and persistent than another, and it depends partly on how many different possible obstacles or variations it can accommodate in order to maintain its path towards the goal. So I suspect what he would say is that it's kind of a matter of degree rather than kind. Organisms are just much more kind of complex and much more plastic and persistent than these simpler kind of cybernetic cases. And also there may be other features that they have. I mean, one thing that strikes me is that organisms have this remarkable capacity to kind of survive through time and regenerate and repair as they go along. And of course you don't really get that with simple cybernetic machines. So yeah, there's going to be some extra features there, but I think that the core idea is meant to be that they both have this kind of organisation which allows them to be plastic and persistent. That's what the two cases have in common. And that's by the way, that's an intrinsic capacity. I think you mentioned this view where something like an artifact inherits its goal-directedness from the creator and what they kind of created it for. But the cybernetic theories, they don't want goal-directedness to be an extrinsic property. It's more of a kind of intrinsic fact about the organisation of the system. Just quickly then on to the reductive question. I think what Nagel really was up to is he wants to try and specify plasticity and persistence in purely mechanistic terms, and to try and help him, I tried to define those terms in a way that didn't mention goals. But at the same time, he does allow that scientists can use teleological models and teleological explanations. This is a point I made in your talk in the Q&A. So it's not that he's not an eliminativist about teleology. He's fine for biologists to use teleological explanation, but he thinks that there's always going to be a mechanistic equivalent, and really the choice between the two is one of emphasis or pragmatic considerations. The teleological one, where you kind of do talk about goals explicitly, will kind of point your attention more towards the end state of a process, whereas the mechanistic explanation is more to do with the starting point and the organisation. So for him, I think it's just a matter of perspective, really, as to which model you go for. Okay, and then quickly at the end, yeah, so the stuff on end-directedness I took from Nick Kroll, because he's another of these people who is a realist about dispositions, and he has a very explicitly teleological definition, which I quite like. And he talks about the directedness of a disposition as an end-directedness. And so one way of thinking about my proposal is that, at least in the kind of cybernetic cases that I discussed, what they have is a kind of complex disposition that has a plastic and persistent profile to it. And then you might just think, well, that's still a disposition, it's just a very complex one, and so goal-directedness then is just kind of a special case of dispositional directedness, which, as I say, Kroll describes as end-directedness. But I'm still not clear on the relation between all these bits of terminology, and it's a very good question. Partly for the reason I mentioned at the end. You know, I'm open to the idea that there could be forms of goal-directedness which aren't very much like dispositions. And if that's the case, then, at least in some cases, you need goal-directedness as a very kind of distinct teleological property that's different to the kind of power form of teleology. Sorry, right at the end, yeah, what's the difference between a disposition and a goal? Well, yeah, maybe, so it's to do with, you know, you'll have two different kinds of dispositions. Maybe this is where this is going. You've got the ones that aren't goal-directed, so they'll be like the disposition that a rock has to roll across the floor. But then as you get to a level of complexity, you'll end up with these systems that have like a special like dispositional property that has that plasticity and persistence. So yeah, maybe there's two kinds of dispositions. It were the goal-directed ones and the non-goal-directed ones. That's one way of thinking about it. Sorry, probably gone over 5 minutes. So I'll finish there.
Now we'll take questions. All right. So, to no particular order, a lot of hands went up immediately.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much for your talk. Hi, I'm Jen. I'm going to like reverse engineer something because it's not, I'm impressed with your one-page handout, but so I'm not familiar with, so I'm like kind of inferring some stuff. But so the definition on the page of plastic and persistent, like you don't have a story yet about like what constitutes a goal. So I'm assuming that what constitutes a goal is just whatever fit, like you have a goal-directed system if it's plastic and if it's persistent, and like plasticity and persistence is defined relative to an S. And so if there is such an S for a goal-directed system, like that counts as a goal. Okay, cool. So so I guess I'm not. I guess like my like question is why not think that once you have a certain pattern that constitutes goal-directedness, that gives you a story about what a goal is for systems generally, but then if you have intentionality on board, there's like a kind of further story that can be told that like supplements that original story rather than like contravening or undermining it. And the thought is just something like you have this stuff, and then once you have a system that like however it happens, has intentionality, it can now represent itself, it can develop the concept of goal, in part to make sense of behavior of other systems, and then represent to itself that it has a goal of some kind, even if, say, I never act towards that goal, and so there is no such behavior, like you wouldn't be able to identify from the third person that I have the goal, you would need to like ask me for something. It's just a function of inner representation. So I'm puzzled about why we think we're supposed to have like a full story of necessary and sufficient conditions for like all goal-directedness in any system, whether it's intentional or not.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of leaning towards agreeing with you because the stuff at the end that I was talking about, where you might have goal-directedness towards an impossible goal, that kind of example might only occur in cases of intentional action. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to think of a cybernetic machine that's directed towards an impossible goal. I mean, how would you create something like that? So I think that's puzzling. So that might just suggest again that there's different kinds of goal-directedness, and that might be one of the mistakes that Nagel's making. Maybe the kind of goal-directedness that we have in intentional action has features that you're not going to find in these kind of simpler cases of cybernetic machines. And as I said at the end, I'm open to this idea. I mean, I've speculatively suggested that a lot of these cases look to me like a kind of dispositional, and that's one way of kind of giving a general analysis, but for reasons you gave, you might want to open other categories up as well.
Just a tiny clarification, I know it's tight. I wouldn't say the division, I don't think you did this, but just to clarify, the division isn't necessarily between intentional systems and non-intentional systems. Like, you'll have these kinds of goals in intentional systems too. It's just that intentional systems are also capable of this further kind of goal-directedness. And so sometimes it's like this kind of story for a goal that I'm pursuing, but sometimes it's this like special intentional story about it. That's it, thanks. Sorry.
David.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, Matthew. So I want to say something in favour of, so in a way, contrary you in favour of persistence and plasticity, and then suggest something against persistence and plasticity, which to my mind is a more fruitful way of attacking those notions. So, I mean, the way you set them up here, they don't look like clearly a success-based account. I don't think the cyberneticists should, or I don't know whether they do, I don't know whilst I looked at their literature, but they certainly shouldn't set it up in a success-based way. All they would need to say, if they want to try and make this out, is to say that in the case of plasticity, well, you've got it here, it's achievable by different, not that it is achieved, or that it's ever achieved, but it's achievable. That's not success.
Sure.
And that persistence would simply be, if the path is blocked, then the system will seek an alternative route, an alternative path. Again, doesn't imply success and is completely compatible with never reaching the goal. So they could have a non-failure based. I think they could accommodate your objection about goal failure by being very careful about how persistence and plasticity are defined. So they have a way there, but against that approach, I would say is that I think it's more fruitful to think of counterexamples where persistence and plasticity just don't get a foothold. So imagine, and there may be such organisms, I don't know, imagine an organism which has developed in a niche or an environment which is incredibly, in some way, simple, stable, and highly predictable, maybe with one kind of prey, and that kind of prey manifests itself in an incredibly predictable and reliable way, so that the particular organism is it's infallible at getting that prey. When the prey's there at noon, it gets the prey. It just jumps out, gets it, and goes back into its little hole, kind of thing, right? It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think of that as a pretty realistic situation in where plasticity and persistence really don't even get a foothold. So, in thinking of plasticity, suppose there are no alternative paths. It's just one path. You have to go rectilinear fashion, get the prey, and go back and hide. There are no alternative paths because there's no the environment's never developed in such a way that such paths are ever needed or available or whatever. Right? And also in the case of persistence again, suppose that if the one single path of success is ever blocked, then you're going to get the same goal failure that every goal system is subject to. We all die, we all get sick. The system, it'll starve to death if it's blocked enough times. So it will never seek an alternative route, it will just die. It's unfortunately, simplicity comes at a price, right? On the one hand, as things are nice and predictable, you'll have infallible success. If things go wrong, you'll die pretty quickly. So there's no meaningful sense in which you talk about plasticity or persistence, and yet to say that that is not an infallible goal-directed system seems to me bizarre. If you deny, not you, but if one were to deny that was goal-directed, that would seem to me to be perverse.
Yeah.
So what do you think about those kinds of counterexamples?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think there's a case by I think Woodfield got that nice book from the 70s on theology. I think